Good morning. It is my pleasure to introduce today our guest speaker for this I Have a Dream Sunday. Peter Flegel is the Executive Director of the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, a cornerstone of Canada's anti-racism strategy. With his diverse team, Peter is driving whole-of-government systems change in the federal government from an anti-racism perspective. This has entailed reaching out and engaging close to 4 million people across Canada to inform policy making, helping shape new federal policies and legislation, collaborating with foreign allies, and working with federal departments and central agencies to implement an anti-racism framework for the federal public service. Peter has a distinguished career as a social entrepreneur, fundraiser, columnist, community organizer, and musician with extensive Canadian and international experience working in multilingual and multicultural settings. He has a history of leadership in the government, NGO, and philanthropic sectors in areas including anti-racism, equity, human rights, innovation, culture, international affairs, and entrepreneurship. Peter Flegel, thank you.
Let me begin by thanking Reverend Elizabeth Bryce for the kind invitation to join you this morning at the Rideau Park United Church. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to be part of your special I Have a Dream service. Having spent many of my formative years as a young activist, a musician, and a thinker, and a teen in the United Church of Canada, in the oldest Black congregation of Quebec, Union United Church, it is always a pleasure for me to break bread and share an important moment on such familiar ground. And I join you from the unceded traditional land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, otherwise known as our nation's capital, Ottawa. It is our duty of truth and reconciliation with the first peoples of this land to constantly and consistently acknowledge the land upon which we stand. And I'm happy to do this morning. So perhaps I could begin by quoting the late Martin Luther King Jr. as he sat in a prison cell in Birmingham, Alabama, 59 years ago. He said, "Just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own town. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states, and I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And so his prophetic words speak to the ubiquity of injustice and its effects. But they also lift a powerful voice in favor of the pursuit of justice and freedom. And they resound like a new song in calling on all to join a worldwide quest for global solidarity. And his words ring true today, as they did 59 years ago, as many of us find ourselves stricken in a world surrounded by the sinking sands of hatred, indifference, racism, and violence. But let us not be fooled. We are not confronting a series of isolated social ills or simply ill-intentioned individuals, or as some may say, against flesh and blood. Rather, we find ourselves wrestling against all-encompassing systems, what some have called principalities and powers, that favor some while they disenfranchise, impoverish, and dehumanize the many. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life story, his personal trajectory as a beacon of hope and a pioneer for racial and economic justice, reminds us that the arc of justice bends transcendentally towards compassion, love, and equity. But it also bends when it is animated by the hearts of those who are willing to take a stand against racism and make an unwavering commitment towards a world where prejudice, inequality, and injustice are no more. That is the calling that lies in front of us as citizens of this great nation that is Canada, but also as citizens of the world, citizens of an interrelated world, to use the words of Martin Luther King Jr. And it is to that calling, that commitment, that vision of love that I'd like to turn this morning. I say a vision of love because we are living in a time in which legions of virtual trolls and bots in the metaverse are mass producing misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation that instructs us to distrust, hate, and even blame our neighbors for all the ills in this world, simply because they are racialized or indigenous, because they are 2S LGBTQI+, because they are Jewish or Muslim or disabled. And it's truly troubling to see how many are falling for this ruse. The legions who have been fooled by the beast of perdition, which continues to lead far too many along the downward spiral of hate and racial prejudice. So in these hard times, it takes a compelling vision of all-embracing love and determination to move a nation forward towards embracing a destiny of full equality, justice, inclusion, and freedom for all. It is upon that firm foundation stone, that precious cornerstone, that we must continue to erect pillars of hope and societal transformation. Pillars that lift us up higher and higher so that we can draw all men, women, and non-binary folk onto that solid rock of equality, liberty, and prosperity. But we must remember that the yarn we are using to weave our vision of the future is still stained by the sins of our past. And to which past am I referring? It is a past defiled by the forcible confinement, slaughter, and systematic exclusion of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit across the country. It is a history that is betrayed by the forcible displacement, enslavement, and segregation of Black people. And it is a legacy contaminated by the Chinese head tax, the Komogata Maru saga, the refusal to accept Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Europe, the Indian residential schools, and Japanese internment, to name but a few unsettling chapters in our collective history. This is not to gloss over the great strides we have made as a country in bending that arc of justice towards our lofty ideal of equity, human rights, and peace, flowing like a river attending the way of our nation. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge those freedom fighters and anti-racism trailblazers, those sung and unsung heroes from all walks of life and backgrounds who paved the way so that the liberties and opportunities many of us take for granted today were enshrined in such legal codes as the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it must be acknowledged that as we have marched towards greater equality and inclusion in our society, we have borne witness to historic transformations. Those have included seeing racialized and Indigenous women appointed as Governor Generals, the highest public office in our country. The transformations have included watching as physicians, professors, scientists, business people, senior executives from racialized, religious minority, and Indigenous communities rise to positions of influence across our country. And we have seen many news broadcasters increase their representation and visibility of news anchors with lived experience of racism on the screen. Yet, these transformations have not washed away the original sin of historic and institutional racism, slavery, and segregation, which even today infect the functioning of our society. We have only to look to the ways in which the pandemic has disproportionately infected Indigenous peoples and racialized and religious minority communities to notice the exacerbation of pre-existing social and economic inequities. We know that over 50% of female inmates in Canada are Indigenous, despite only making up 4% of the total female Canadian population. We know that at the onset of COVID, urban neighborhoods with large Black populations had the highest mortality and infection rates compared to those with small Black populations. We also know that joblessness has skyrocketed among Arab, Black, Southeast Asian, and South Asian Canadians compared to their white counterparts during this pandemic. This speaks, unfortunately, to a wounded nation, a nation that must strive to do more to heal from that sickness that is racism, which continues to afflict our collective soul. The Government of Canada has made a commitment to work with Canadians across the country to stamp out systemic racism, discrimination, and hate from our society. Through Canada's anti-racism strategy launched in 2019, we have been building a foundation for change which sees demonstrating federal leadership, empowering communities, and raising awareness and changing attitudes at the heart of our commitment to creating a better society. The Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, which I have the privilege of heading, has been working tirelessly with thousands of people from coast to coast to coast. Together, we are working to ensure that federal policies, programs, services, and legislation are designed in ways that center the needs and realities of communities that continue to bear the brunt of systemic racism. And to date, our work has helped contribute to the creation of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of new programs to support such things as budding Black entrepreneurs, emergency grassroots initiatives for communities struggling with COVID, and a national campaign to tackle the nationwide explosion in anti-Asian racism. But we know that more can and should be done, that we must press on in our effort to eradicate systemic racism, discrimination, and hate from our society. And we know that the threat of losing ground is real. We also know that shady transnational entities are committed to seeing diverse societies like ours flounder as more and more abandon universal principles of justice, human rights, and anti-racism in favor of authoritarianism, xenophobia, and chauvinism. And we know that we are only strong as a society if we all have an equitable opportunity to succeed. But this work, my team and I cannot do on our own. We depend on people like you, people who share our vision of a better country, to continue speaking out, to continue organizing for change, and dare I say, to continue pressing us to do the right thing. Then and only then can we both get closer to achieving that vision Martin Luther King Jr. articulated in his I Have a Dream speech. And so to close, let me cite the late Reverend when he spoke on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. He said, "We cannot walk alone, and as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back." Thank you. Merci.